We're going to be at 1 Samuel chapter 8. Last week we did 1 Samuel 7, which got us to the end of the first section of that book. But we're going to make our way there tonight by way of Deuteronomy chapter 17. So that's where we will begin, Deuteronomy chapter 17. As you're making your way there, as we all are, somebody remind me, up to now in the book of 1 Samuel, what era of Israel's history have we been considering? The era of the Judges, correct. At the end of the book of Judges, there is a section, the concluding section, beginning at chapter 17 and extending through the end of the book, which essentially details the spiritual and moral condition of Israel. We went over that in some detail when we began our study of 1 Samuel. 4 times in that section, beginning at Judges 17 and going to the end, there is a refrain that is repeated. And it serves to characterize this era of the Judges. Does anybody remember what that is? Okay, every man, every woman did what was right in their own eyes. So this is a period of extreme moral laxity, to put it very, very mildly, right? So according to the writer of Judges, what is the remedy for this condition? Why is it that the people are in this condition in the first place? And by implication, what is going to help this condition of doing what is right, everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, rather than what's right, of course, in God's eyes? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So according to the writer of Judges, kingship in Israel, at least a certain kind of kingship, a certain kind of monarchy, is a good thing. And it has been suggested before that 1 Samuel, which opens in the closing years of this period of the Judges when there is no king, and then of course 1 Samuel tells us how Israel got its first king, and then of course its second king, etc., on into the book of Kings, where we get into the third king and then the division of the kingdom. It has been suggested before that 1 Samuel is something of a defense of the idea of a righteous king, that this is what is needed in Israel to solve this spiritual problem, or something that could be used in the hands of God to solve this spiritual problem. There is no righteous king who follows God. Therefore, everybody does what is right in their own eyes. So 1 Samuel might be seen then to be a defense of the need for a righteous king in Israel. Now that might seem to be called into question by 1 Samuel chapter 8. Because as we're going to see, the people ask for a king. And it is not a good request. God says that they're abandoning me. They're turning their backs on me in asking for a king. And so it might seem as though that kingship really isn't all that good. But when you look at Deuteronomy 17, and you see the law as it's given by God through Moses, you find in Deuteronomy 17 that there is a law laid out for the coming king. In fact, God had already prophesied in the book of Genesis. We won't go to these texts, but Genesis 17, Genesis 49, if you'd like to look through some of those later on. Excuse me, guys, I'm sorry. Genesis 17, Genesis 49, there is a prophecy already that there will be kings. I mean, in Genesis 17, you have God saying that kings are going to come forth from Abraham. Abraham, of course, being the progenitor of the Jewish race, of the Israelite nation. In Genesis 49, we find that the kingship of Israel is going to be located in what tribe? Which of the 12 tribes of Israel? Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah, right? That's the prophecy that is given. And so we are at the very beginning of the story told to expect kingship in Israel, right? Well, in Deuteronomy 17, as I said, as the people are on the cusp of entering the promised land, the wilderness generation has died out. Moses himself is about to die. Joshua will lead them into the promised land. We have here a law concerning the king. So it's not forbidden, in other words, by God that the people have a king. But the people must have a certain kind of king. Let me just say that one more time. God does not forbid Israel from having a king. But if they do, it is to be a certain kind of king. Keep that in mind. And as we read through this, I want you to take note of what kind of king Israel is supposed to have. All right? Verse 14 of Deuteronomy 17. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, the promised land, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. So this is not a vote. This isn't something for you people to do. This is the person that God will choose. And that's going to play, obviously, a major role in the book of 1 Samuel. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not one of your countrymen. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself. Please take note of this. This is very important. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. So, what is verse 16 prohibiting? The king is not to raise a what? An army. The king is not to have a standing army. So horses here are a symbol of that is a powerful component in an ancient military, right? So he's not supposed to multiply horses for himself. He's not to be a warrior king. Verse 17, he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. You may have a certain king of Israel in mind right now. Anybody? Solomon. But you know, his dad also had multiple wives. Even David, apparently, went against this one. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. So, not to be a rich, very wealthy man. Now it shall come about, verse 18, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in the kingdom in the midst of Israel. I love this last part. He's supposed to be a Bible scholar, a scribe. Each king is to have his own copy of the law that he himself copied. Remember, we're in the ancient world here. If you want a copy of a document, how do you get that copy? You copy it down by hand, or you have somebody else do it for you, right? We talked about that. That's the way it has been for most of human history up until the invention of movable type printing at the end of the Middle Ages by Johannes Gutenberg, 1400s. So he is to write for himself his own copy. I mean, you know, imagine if you were given the task of sitting down and writing, copying the law of Moses as it's given in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. you would begin to study this, right? You would begin to meditate on it. And not just that, not just are you to copy it, but then you're to read it every day so that you would be godly. So this is the kind of king Israel is to have. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Any questions or comments as we make our way to 1 Samuel 8? All right. I want you to have that background. You need to have that background as we begin to read about the beginning of Israel's monarchy. All right? God will allow a king, but only a king who is in full submission to his law, his commandment, his word, one who lives as God's servant. So in reality, even though Israel might have a king, according to Deuteronomy 17, who's still the ultimate ruler of Israel? God. This king is just sort of his representative among the people. Because if God's law holds sway for the king, then he will lead the people in fulfillment of the law of God. And so when you get to Judges then, what kind of king is Judges talking about? There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Is he talking about just any kind of king? No. He's talking about a Deuteronomy 17 kind of king. The kind of king who himself trusts in the Lord, and he doesn't raise up armies because he knows that God will deliver him and his people. He doesn't trust in having a lot of wealth, material possession. He doesn't multiply wives for himself, which, by the way, how do you multiply wives? If you're a king, you enter into alliances with foreign powers. And in order to seal the alliance, you marry. You marry into the ruling family of this nation as a way to seal that alliance. That's what happened with Solomon. Why would you want to enter into foreign alliances? Because you want somebody to have your back in case you go to war. So this is a man who trusts fully in God, not in others, and he obeys the law of God. That is the Deuteronomy 17 king, and who leads others in the practice of the law, who does not allow idolatry, who does not allow for the proliferation of idols and for pagan religion, right? So this is the kind of king that Judges is speaking of. So with that in mind, we're going to cover 1 Samuel chapter 8. And it came about when Samuel was old. So now we've gotten pretty far down the timeline, right? We started out in this book before Samuel was even born. We saw him when he was born. We saw him when he was handed over as a very, very young child to Eli, to the priest, to live at Shiloh. Last week we saw him acting as a judge, as a military leader. Well, now he's old. And by the way, he's still got a lot to do. This is not the end of Samuel's story. He doesn't actually, his death is not recorded until chapter 25. So he still has much to do. But at this point, he is old. So it came about when he was old that he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. So apparently he's old enough now that he needs help. And what does he do? He establishes a hereditary judgeship. Now, I want somebody, raise your hand if you would like to flip over. You don't all have to do this. You can if you want. But I want somebody to read Judges 8, 22 to 23. Can somebody raise your hand and volunteer to do that? Am I going to have to ask? Okay, Jim. All right, Judges chapter 8, verses 22 to 23.
Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, which have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from this spoil."
That's enough. I'm sorry. I may have told you a little bit more. That's good. That's good. So because of Gideon's extraordinary success in leading Israel against the Midianites, because this mighty man of valor, right, this so-called mighty man of valor, who's anything but a mighty man of valor, a little bit of sarcasm going on in the story. It's a great story. So the Lord has delivered Israel by the hand of Gideon. And so what do the people want? Jim just read it. What do they want for Gideon to do? Establish a dynasty of judges. So Gideon, let your sons keep ruling. And what does Gideon say? No. No. Okay, God's going to rule over you. Right. So when you read the judges were not, there was nothing hereditary. It didn't pass from father to son. Judges were chosen by God and were given a special gifting in order to be able to do what God called them to do at that particular point in time. They were not kings. They did exercise a ruling function, but they didn't pass down their authority to their children, and so on and so on. So Samuel has introduced something new. And it's hard to know because the writer of Samuel doesn't come out and say this explicitly, but it appears as though Samuel is not doing the right thing here. As godly as Samuel is, as much as God has used him, it does seem as though he's kind of failing at this point. God never told him to do this. He's sort of taking matters into his own hands. Verse 2. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel. The name of his second, Abiah. They were judging in Beersheba. Beersheba is in the southern part, at the southern tip of Israel. And look at the striking similarity here between Samuel and Eli, the priest. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and took bribes, and perverted justice. So it seems as though this is not something that Samuel should have done in the first place, and now that he has appointed his sons as judges, well, they're evil and they're wicked men, and so they turn aside for dishonest gain, they take bribes, and they pervert justice, which is something, by the way, that is expressly forbidden. For a judge to condemn the innocent or to justify the guilty. So this is what they're doing. Verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel at Ramah. Apparently they see what's going on here. They understand that it's not right to have Samuel's sons doing this. And so they've got a specific request for Samuel. And they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old. You're nearing the end. And your sons don't walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us." And here is the key part of their request. Do not miss it. What does the text say? What do they say? Appoint a king to judge us, what? Like all the other nations. Verse 20 is going to go into a little bit more detail and tell us more about their motives. But right here is the indication. It is not that they come to Samuel and say simply, "We would like a king. We like your idea about a hereditary dynasty. It's not working out with your family, but just give us a king." The problem is not that they have asked for a king, so it seems. The problem is in what kind of king they want. A king like all the other nations. Israel has been called by God to be a holy nation. What does holy mean? Set apart. Is Israel to be like all the other nations? Absolutely not. Their king is certainly not to be like all the other kings. What they're wanting, as we're going to see, is for somebody to go out and fight for them. Somebody to protect them. Remember, they've been having all the problems out of the Philistines. Apparently that's not gone away. They're worried about their predicament, surrounded by all these nations. By the way, Israel, that part of the world, is an incredibly important tract of land. It's the crossroads of the ancient world. I mean, still to this day, an incredibly important part of the world. So Israel is surrounded by neighbors that are hostile. We want a king who will do battle for us, a king who will protect us, a king like all the other nations. That is the substance of what they want. Verse 6, but this thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel, when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. Now, why is it displeasing? Well, it could be that he's got entirely noble motives here, that he recognizes the spiritual declension that has happened since the last revival that broke out, that we read about in chapter 7, where the people turned to the Lord. It could be. But there could also be some selfish motives going on in Samuel. Why does it displease Samuel? Verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you. That's why it's displeasing to Samuel. Samuel feels rejected at this point. He's trying to establish a dynasty that will continue to judge the people. Not quite a kingship, but something very similar to it, and the people don't want it. So he feels personally slighted, personally rejected. I think that's a fair reading of this. But what does God say? They have rejected me from being king over them. In asking for a king like the other nations, again, operative term, like the other nations, they are showing a rejection of God's rulership over them. Because a king like the other nations is not going to lead them in righteousness. A king like the other nations, as we're going to see, will oppress them, not help them. Verse 8, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this very day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the way, the procedure of the king who will reign over them. Verse 10, so Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure, this will be the custom, the way of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. So he's going to raise an army. He's not supposed to do that according to Deuteronomy 17, but God says that's what he's going to do. Verse 12, he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and his equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and your vineyards and will give it to his officers and to his servants. Just a way of centralizing his power, taking from you and giving it to them. In other words, he's going to tax you. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves, verse 17 says, will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. It'll be time to reap the consequence. You made your bed, now it's time to lie in it. Verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. Verse 20, here is where we get to the bottom of this whole thing. This is where their motives shine, so that we may be like all the other nations, which means that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. The people have seen God act on their behalf time after time after time after time. But now they say, look, we want the warrior king. That's what everybody else has. That's what everybody else has. We want him because he will keep us safe. So you begin to see, do you not, that this is exactly what God has said it is. This is a rejection of his kingship. This is a refusal to trust him to do what he's always done, to provide. They didn't need a standing army. He was going to take care of all their adversaries for them. If there needed to be a fight, they would raise the army, God would empower them, and they would go out and do it, just like we read in chapter 7. So we want a king to go out to fight our battles. We don't care what's going to happen to us. Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice and appoint for them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. And that is the end of chapter 8, and then we will begin the story of Saul, who is most certainly not a godly king and will most certainly do many of the things that are spoken of here. Now, the focus of 1 Samuel is on what character? 1 and 2 Samuel. Which king? David. David is a far cry better than Saul. He's the greatest king that Israel ever had. A man after God's own heart. He's not perfect. He's still got the issues. He falls in a very major way, and we all understand about that: murder, adultery, cover up, all of that. But he's described through it all as a man who is loyal to God, loyal fundamentally to God. And the people prosper because of it. David comes close to that Deuteronomy 17 ideal, but he never gets there. Okay? He never quite makes it because no human being can. So ultimately, we understand that, yes, there must be a king to lead us in righteousness. Israel never had that king. God blessed them with some very good kings, but they all fell short in one way or another. And so when we come to Christ, we come to the fulfillment of all of the kingly hopes of Israel. Finally, here is Israel's true king. And isn't it interesting that even though God said they don't want me to rule over them anymore, they want a king of their own making? Isn't it fascinating how God uses the house of David to bring them the greatest king, to bring us the greatest king who will lead us in righteousness, and it's none other but God himself. They reject God as being king over them, and yet God uses this request for a king to continue to set in motion this trajectory that will lead to the Messiah, who is God in human flesh, Israel's true king, the world's true king. So God will rule over his people. Is there any question or comment before we close down for this evening? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Because the Lord would have been hearing what they were saying anyway.
Right.
What do you think is the significance of that?
I don't know. Let's see. Verse 6, Samuel prays to the Lord, and then God tells him they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So he just goes back to the Lord and says, this is what they said. It's sort of like in the first place when he prays to the Lord, and he's obviously talking to the Lord about what they've just asked. And then God says, look, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. This is the big issue, right? This is not about you, it's about me. And so I would take that personally as just, this is Samuel going back to the Lord to speak to him about these things that are going on. I mean, this is a tumultuous time. Things are changing rapidly. And so that's how I personally would take it. Obviously, of course, God knows what's going on. but it's just like, I might go to the Lord and just talking to him myself about, Lord, this thing is going on and with my family or with church or with something else. And it's obviously not like I'm informing God of anything, but does me a lot of good to talk about it. So that's how I would personally take it. But it's a good question, kind of, wondering why that verse is there.
So maybe communicating that Samuel didn't just go, respond in his own, that he actually sought counsel from
Absolutely.
before he followed up or made a decision with the people.
Absolutely. And so then in chapter 9, of course, we get into the beginning of the narrative concerning Saul, and Saul starts off on a grand note, right? Falls pretty quickly, but starts off on a pretty good note. And then, of course, God sends him later in chapter 16 to Jesse's house and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think most certainly this is, he's conversing with God about the things that are about to happen. Because God is going to lead him to Saul and then, of course, lead him to David. Good. Yes, sir. Tommy?
The first words in chapter 8, when Samuel became old, you said that it shows his death in about chapter 25. You said he had more work to do.
Oh, yeah, a whole lot more.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, don't allow advanced age to make you think it's over, because he's going to do a whole lot more in these next several chapters than what we read about in the first 7. So yeah, that's a good point, brother. That's a good point. I'd love to know how old he was. He's old enough to have grown children, but I'd love to know how old. And in the last chapter. In chapter 7 at the beginning, it jumps 20 years when the ark goes to Kiriath Yearim and it stays there for 20 years. And so we've got massive chunks of Samuel's life that we don't know anything about really, just that he's judging Israel. And now he's old and he's about to do he's going to do his greatest work in Israel in these next several chapters. He's going to confront Saul's sin, and he's going to be the means by which God raises up the greatest of Israel's kings and the forefather of the Messiah. So yeah, it's not just he's got a lot to do, he's got his greatest work yet to do. Good deal. Yes, sir. Charles?
Kings 23:25, talking about Josiah, it says, before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him.
Yeah.
So, but David was still greater.
Yeah, I would, the fact that David is given that centerpiece, and even, Josiah, of course, we understand not a perfect king. But as far as, Josiah might not have committed quite the sins that his forefather David had. But in terms of his position in Israel's history, as well as being the house that is established for the everlasting kingship, I think it's beyond question that he's the greatest of Israel's kings, as far as in that respect. Yes. And so we have to be careful. Yeah. So I would argue in terms of that. But that's a good point to bring out, most certainly.
God is the only one that gave that kind of recommendation of a king.
Oh, right.
Here is a man
After my own heart.
or the apple of my eye.
Yeah, right. So, and the fact that, he's given such attention in the scriptures shows that his status. He may not have been as morally pure as somebody like a Josiah, but God certainly used him in a fashion quite different than any other one. Hang on just a second, buddy. All right. Well, let me pray for us and we'll be dismissed. Lord God, thank you for this time. And we're grateful